Um, in these overlapping sections on new patterns of leadership, and then cases from individual cities, we have some snippets of big theories, and then some of them general and vague, others getting very specific, and then sometimes extreme, we can call them outlier examples of the theories. One big theory, for instance, is post-industrial society, that in the sense that if the economic base changes and we move away from the manufacturing that defined capitalism in its classic era and sense for many following one perspective or certain perspectives. And many talk of the world today as moving into a post-industrial era or world. At the same time, if we look more closely, there are people who still live in jungles. There are people and who hunt for food, for hunting in the sense of killing animals, looking for ferns or barley or whatever. They're farmers. They're that is, we have all kinds of pre-industrial. So when I gave you a whole list of the new social movements, that is, new social movements were one, the others were unions, there were civic groups, there were political parties. The point is, these things all coexist today. And so history is there surrounding us on Michigan Avenue, on Fifth Avenue, on the Champs-Élysées, and so forth, and having a sense of the resonance of these and how they meaningfully can interact, even if it's done ironically, with humor, with exaggeration, with music, with background. These all count. That is, these symbolisms are increasingly being paid attention to. They were maybe more often earlier by artists, by literary critics, and journalists are in between. Social scientists are generally not there, but a few are. And so in conjunction with the idea that cities are often major places for innovation, where and how are some innovating ideas emerging in conjunction with these big concepts? So I mentioned one, post-industrial society. Two, a major city in this example, outlier was and is Paris. Around the end of the 18th century, the big English cities were in the lead internationally in the industrialization of the world. They built factories and they generated a lot of smoke in Birmingham and Liverpool and London. They started to build a few factories in Paris. And immediately people said, stop, we're getting smoke on Paris. We don't want this. And so the leaders of Paris around 1800, a little thereafter, said, no smoke in Paris, no industry. They didn't say explicitly, we will be a post-industrial city, but they did it. How can you advance economically, socially, culturally, whatever, without industry? They found a way. And so how to make sense of this, I will turn to first briefly and mention two names. One's featured explicitly on the reading list, which is Benjamin. The second I'll just mention as well as background is Jürgen Habermas, Jurgenhabermas. When I was a student in Frankfurt, the so-called Frankfurt School of Sociology, the leaders were Adorno and Horkheimer, and a young Turk then was named Jürgen Habermas. And he came back, he took over one of the chairs. So he's the continuation of the Frankfurt School. And he does so in being continually innovative, but his habilitation, sort of the big thesis, his big argument, one of his big arguments was that we have big differences between England and the continent. So if we ask in terms of our 5 theories at the beginning of this course, we've got leadership, we've got markets, we've got the arts, we've got innovation. How do these things combine, and where and why is one of them, where and why particularly are the arts more important or less important? And how might that lead the markets to be more important or less important? All right, that's a big abstract question. Habermas gave an answer, and he pointed to the differences between England and the continent. England was where they had coffee houses. Paris is where they had cafes. And the English coffee houses, you had people who were doing betting, throwing darts, not just throwing darts, but you had a sense of playfulness, and the bets were saying, you know, I wager that your ship will not come in. 2 to 1, you want to bet? And your ship may have, and so that led in turn to insurance companies. It led to the London stock market. It led to all kinds of leveraged loans and creative financial instruments. It led to, in the political arena, John Locke writing about democracy, Hobbes, and attacking Hobbes. These kinds of things were actively discussed and debated in the coffee houses of England in ways that they were not in Germany and France and others on the continent. Why not? Conversely, the market. The market was front and center and actively discussed, as was democracy, as was leadership, and criticized. If you tried to talk about this in a Paris cafe, you could be arrested. Or if you tried to create a civic group or publish a book, your book would be seized by the publisher. The censorship applied to publishing of anything, newsletters, of sheet, of paper. No civic groups were permitted in much of France through the 19th century. Why? Why the difference? The simple answer is the authoritarian political systems, I mean, obviously it's relative, but more authoritarian than they were in England at the same time, led to a sense that the political leadership can and should control what's going on intellectually and culturally. In China today, they call this cultural policy. And it's a clear active residue today, and it's actively discussed, and it's changing week by week within Paris, within Beijing, within other contexts, not to mention, et cetera, Middle East and so forth. Habermas made the point then that the coffee shop was a core of an ostensibly entertainment venue, but it generated new ideas, and those ideas encapsulated in the discussions created institutions like the stock market, the insurance companies, which enhanced trade and led to the singing of Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britannia ruled the waves from London to India to Australia, New Zealand, and places, and they had open battles with other little countries were out there with them at the beginning. The French, the Dutch, little Dutch ships managed to they were there, I think, in India before the English. So the Dutch entrepreneurial sea captains were right out there, but they didn't have as many troops and naval officers as the British, and so the Dutch tended to decline, although the Calvinist spirit may have been part of this entrepreneurship in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, which fits with Max Weber, for instance. So if we mention Max Weber, we mention Habermas, we mention the contrast between England and the continent, if they censored these things like John Locke's writings on democracy, what did people talk about and write about and think about? And what was more central in Paris? And how could Paris escape the Industrial Revolution successfully? Who wants to try to answer that? And you can draw on the readings if you want. That is, part of the course should lead us to think about the big, hard questions like that, as well as how can we fix the pothole better? How can we have a better kind of machine that fixes potholes? Or how can we have divvy bikes? All of these are important for cities, but if you don't, we want to remember the power idea of decisions are also non-decisions. And if you don't even think about something, you're not likely to start having a committee in the city council to study it. So they didn't study a lot of things in Paris, which they didn't study starting big insurance companies the way that they did in London. But what did they do that was in many ways ahead of the English? What was more salient? We don't have public opinion surveys in 1800. They only started just around World War II. So we can't know what was in the minds of everybody. We can't have surveys of percentage support for Trump versus Biden or other things. We only have Napoleon. But one related concept which we've read and talked about briefly is buzz. We can look at things which captured buzz at the time, such as what were considered some of the most popular novels. And who were the most widely read and discussed novelists, painters, artists, musicians? What type of music? What were the activities listed at the height of a celebration in a parade, or in the activities in Versailles, which was the center of European and world power and culture at the time? This was something which was done and followed up much more seriously by a second German who'd also almost gotten a PhD. Habermas did get his PhD there, but I think, yeah. But Walter Benjamin was more guarded. He had a literary critic background, but at the same time, he then increasingly wrote about social issues, and he was an open, in many ways, Marxist. So he was close to Frankfurt, but he wrote a book on Berlin, wrote another book based on personal participant observation. He wrote a book on Moscow, lots of essays. Then, for various theoretical and other reasons, he went to Paris. And Paris, for the reasons that I've articulated, really captured his imagination. So he lived there the second half or more of his life. And he did books like, they were not published, they were not actively read at the time, but in the post-industrial era, things like this became very hot stuff. He tried to theorize where and why Paris was so hugely successful. What was one of his main sources here in this book and in his others? He walked around, he read the newspapers, he also read books, and he read some of the work of some people that was the most important. He didn't have a public opinion surveys, but he did know some of the names of the people who were considered the most important. I'm reminding us, okay, of recording. We've got, yeah, Gray, you've got you're doing your backups recording, I think. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. Novel.
Professor, I had a.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just had a quick clarifying question. So, would you say that? So, when we talk about cultural policy, would you say that the different countries had, like, their different type of cultural policy and openness enabled places such as the coffee houses to spark these conversations and innovations, basically?
Yeah, enabled, I missed a word. Enabled the conversations to what? What's your verb?
So I'm thinking, so the difference in the cultural policy in the different cities that you talk about, would you say that that is the main reason that there was places such as the coffee houses that enabled conversation and innovation?
Cultural policy as a term today usually implies government makes the policy. If you have individual entrepreneurs opening or closing coffee houses on their own, that's not a cultural policy. And the cultural policy can be censorship in Paris, but in England, they didn't have censorship in that way. So no is the simple, crude answer, because government, and so people don't talk about cultural policy much in the US at all. We do it implicitly, or that is, it's being done, but it's much more decentralized. And so the term policy is generally not used in that context in the US. I mean, so that's the quick, simple answer. By contrast, it's very, very central and very actively and openly discussed in China. And so I'm playing Chinese here and deliberately making contrasts across periods and countries in ways that shock a little bit. And so I apologize if I did that too much, but let me, as soon as Andy comes back, we'll see how, if she's about ready with a video or two. Yeah, you're okay. What do you have on Paris is just about ready. That is, I don't want to talk too long here. Yeah, you're mute.
Sorry about that. I have the arcades video.
Okay, why don't you just show a little bit on that? So I've flashed it here.
An intoxication comes over the man who walks long and aimlessly through the streets. With each step, the walk takes on greater momentum. Ever weaker grow the temptations of bistros, of shops, of smiling women. Ever more irresistible the magnetism of the next street corner, of a distant square in the fog, of the back of a woman walking before him. Then comes hunger. He wants, however, nothing to do with the myriad possibilities offered to sate his appetite, but like an animal, he prowls through unknown districts in search of food, in search of a woman, until utterly exhausted, he stumbles into his room, which receives him coldly and wears a strange air. That anamnestic intoxication in which the flaneur goes about the city not only feeds on the sensory data taking shape before his eyes, but can very well possess itself of abstract knowledge, indeed of dead facts, as something experienced and lived through. This felt knowledge, as is obvious, travels above all by word of mouth from one person to another. From The Arcades Project by Walter Benjamin.
Okay, who is speaking there? Or what's the name of the actor who is speaking? The term is the flaneur, F-L-A-N-E-U-R. A wanderer, a walker, a prowler, as various translations, thinking thoughts that might be those there, which you got from Benjamin's hand. But more generally, it was the core original idea that defined this as a major work. And I'm simplifying a little bit, but it's a key concept. And when I talked about this and said, well, I won't add the other details, but I had 2 French students one year from Paris, and they said, we never heard this discussed about Benjamin before. Benjamin's a classic Marxist. Doesn't he talk about class consciousness, about Haussmann, about the boulevards being constructed to defend capitalism, etc.? And so the answer is yes, of course, it's all here. And he sort of slipped in the flaneur along with many other things. He didn't feature it as the center. But if you say that as you saw in the video, these thoughts can drive the choices of the walker to make economic decisions as well as lifestyle decisions, then is that superstructure or substructure? What's our next video, Andy?
Are we also looking for one on?
Yeah, there are about 5 in a row, and we want to get we want to do them quickly because they're only maybe half a minute or a minute each. But we got to go through them pretty quickly.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have them in the same order, but I have a few on Baudelaire.
Okay. All right.
I also have the Renovation of Paris.
Yeah, no, Renovation of Paris is what we want first, if you got that. So this is Haussmann. So Haussmann was the baron. He was the governor of the area of Paris. And here he is. So here he's featured.
French social reformer wrote, Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery and pestilence and disease work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place where plants wither and perish. Industrialization and rapid growth had simply left infrastructure behind, and in the 19th century, Emperor Napoleon III undertook one of the most ambitious plans of renovation ever undertaken in any city, anywhere. And to oversee that renovation, he chose the skillful and audacious George Eugene Haussmann. And between 1853 and 1870, Haussmann transformed Paris from a squalid, disease-ridden city of the Middle Ages to the modern era with broad avenues, effective sewers, and beautiful parks. It is history that deserves to be remembered. By the 19th century, the overcrowding of Paris had become an acute social issue. As far back as 1739, the writer Voltaire had complained that the streets were showing off their filthiness and spreading infection. The first Napoleon had ambitious plans as well, writing from his prison on St. Helena, that if he'd had 20 more years of rule and a little leisure, one would vainly search today for the old Paris. Nothing would remain of it but vestiges. The widest streets in the worst neighborhoods were only 5 meters, the narrowest only 2. Carts and horses could hardly navigate these parts of the city. Elected the first president of France in 1848, Napoleon III worked as president to beautify the city, but was able to accomplish very little. It wasn't until he overthrew the government and declared himself emperor that the project would begin in earnest. After selecting Haussmann to oversee the project, the emperor asked him to give the city more air and space, to make it beautiful and to better connect the sprawling capital. The first stage of the project was to complete the Grand Creuset de Paris, a great cross that would bisect the center of the city, and which had begun under the first Napoleon. The emperor wanted a new hotel built, the first luxury hotel in the city, the Grand Hôtel du Louvre, in time for the Exhibition Universelle in Paris. The exhibition was a kind of World's Fair held in 1855. It was held partially as a response to the Great Exhibition held in London 4 years earlier. Haussmann relished the challenge and worked 24 hours a day, had 3,000 workmen finish the most important parts of the cross and the hotel in time for the exhibition. The project involved tearing down enormous sections of the city, a task that Haussmann called the gutting of old Paris. Many of the neighborhoods torn down were simply turned into the broad avenues that define the city today, and many small streets were eliminated entirely in favor of one navigable one. This was only possible because Napoleon III had made himself emperor. He had the parliament change the law so that Haussmann could seize land on either side of the streets, and he reported only to the emperor himself. Haussmann finished the cross in 1859, centered at a large square that was widened with 2 new theaters, which still stand today, facing each other across the Fontaine de Palmer, a victory fountain built under Napoleon I to memorialize his greatest military victories. The fountain itself was moved to sit at the exact center of the square and redecorated with sphinxes and more, designed by architect Gabriel Daviod. Daviod was almost as important to the project as Haussmann. While Haussmann worked on the greater design of the city, Daviod was the architect for many notable buildings built during this time, including the theaters in the central square, as well as other distinctively Parisian street furniture. He designed benches, balustrades, fountains.
Don't let it run for too long. So each of these has a start and an ending time. Are you conscious of that?
Yeah, it's just hard for me to see what the starting and ending time is while I have it playing.
Okay.
So just stop me when.
Yeah, I don't know myself unless Gray, could you help then? Would you be able to get my email that went to both of you and just tell her, I mean, we're over time.
Yep, can't do that.
Just we can't do everything, although this is great stuff. Okay, so I'd say what else do we have for today? Because you get the flavor of what happened in the mid-19th century. You get the flavor of the beautification, but also heavy-handed leadership. This was very heavy-handed, strong cultural policy.
Okay.
Gray, can you easily find my email?
Yep, I've got it pulled up.
You know, let's just, what order are they in? Because Andy doesn't know the order because she's got them all open.
I just looked. The next one, well, the next 3 are all on Baudelaire.
Okay, so Baudelaire enters because he was the leading cultural figure, most popular person at the mid to late 19th century, going on simultaneous with this. And then he connects to the Arcade Project because how did Benjamin study the ethos, the Protestant ethic, if you will, the analog, the non-Protestant ethic? What was there? What did Max Weber do? He read Benjamin Franklin and he read about Calvinist religion. Benjamin read Baudelaire. So Baudelaire was not just critical because of he's one person. He was the ethos, the ideal of many, let's say at least leading figures, especially younger persons in Paris at the time. And the flaneur could drive the economy because consumption was there through the 19th century and was not only reinvented after Marx or after the Depression or the second or whatever of these. That is, the French did this from 1800 and earlier on up to present. Okay, so Baudelaire, how did Baudelaire capture this? Why don't we take a look a little bit of if we got videos on Baudelaire. The details are here. This has got more clips and quotes and so forth on Baudelaire than
in spirit. However, he left the vessel and returned to Paris. At age 21 in the year of 1842, he inherited his father's fortune and began his literary career in the Latin Quarter of Paris. It is believed around this period that he contracted syphilis from frequenting prostitutes. Oh boy. At this time, he met his notorious mistress, Jeanne Duval, a Creole woman of whom his family did not approve. She was one of 4 women who inspired Charles Baudelaire's greatest work, Les Fleurs du Mal. During their lengthy and stormy relationship, Jeanne Duval was emotionally abusive toward Charles. She delighted in toying with him, having affairs with friends of his, getting him hooked on drugs such as hashish and opium, and getting him deeper into debt. So this relationship continued on and off throughout the years. He also had a relationship with painter and model, the beautiful Apollonie Sabatier, and actress Marie Dabrun. Charles was also a big fan of wine and was a famous absinthe drinker. By 1844, he had squandered at least half of his inheritance, prompting his family to fight for a lawyer to handle Charles's finances. and provide him with an allowance until his death. His writing career began with art criticism, and he also released an autobiographical novella titled La Fanfarlo in 1847. Prior to releasing Les Fleurs du Mal, his greatest achievement in writing was considered to be his English to French translations of Edgar Allan Poe's work. They are widely considered to be among the best. In 1857, he finally published the first edition of his greatest work, Les Fleurs du Mal. Quite obsessed about ensuring the quality of his work, he took a room next to the publishing house so he could oversee the process. Six of the poems in the collection, however, were banned in France until 1949, containing subject matter such as lesbianism and vampires. The second edition of Les Fleurs du Mal, he added 35 poems. One of the things Les Fleurs du Mal is known for is its explicit sexual content, the link between beauty and decay, and, significantly, the relationship between death and sensuality. Because of his personal eccentricities and his work, he was dubbed Poète Maudit, the cursed poet in French. One friend even reported that Charles, in the midst of conversation, asked him, "Wouldn't it be agreeable to take a bath with me?" I can imagine his friend was something like, "Dude, I love you, but not that much. Stay back." In the 1860s, Charles's health began to decline. In 1862, he started suffering from horrible nightmares. When he left for Brussels to give some lectures in 1863, a series of strokes left him partially paralyzed. He finally passed away August 31st, 1867, at the age of 46, most likely from syphilis. So, there's a brief biography on Charles Baudelaire, and trust me, it only scratches the surface of the man himself. But Adrian, you ask.
Okay, we have another one. You said 3 on Baudelaire?
Yeah, let me check.
I asked the TAs earlier last year, how can we present Baudelaire? And one of them said, well, maybe someone reading his work.
In here that I found really fascinating. Griswold is ignorant of the fact that poets, more than any other type of men, enjoy that wonderful privilege attributed to Parisian and Spanish women of having the secret of dressing well with the poorest trifles, and that Poe, lover of beauty in all things, would have found the art of transforming palace of new design. Whoa. Like I said, you really get more of a perspective and more.
Okay, so the suggestion was we should read, but instead we looked a little further and we found others who had more color, flavor, style. But there's one more which gives you, again, a little message of the contemporary versions of how this lives on the internet today. All this stuff is on YouTube and such.
Is depressed is reading this. I believe he's teaching a class in the novel, and he reads from Baudelaire to the class. Be calm, my pain, and venture to be still. You clambered for the night. It falls, is here. The city shrouds itself in blackest chill, brings peace to some, to others fear. 'Neath pleasure's lash, the grim high executioner, mortal souls, that vile and worthless throng, reap grim remorse amidst the abject ceremony. Pain, take my hand, let us now along. Yeah, good goosebumps there. I love that last line.
Okay, what else do we have?
We have the Norwich and or Norquist, sorry, and that's it.
Okay, now that's down the line. All right, so you get the quick overview of the complicated multiple themes of the Arcade project: consumption, lifestyle, death, Bohemia. Just a word on Bohemia. Clearly, we've got it in spades here. And you don't need to have an abstract definition. You can look at that look at what you just saw. The concept of cities and neighborhoods was articulated by Balzac, 1820 or so, most popular novelist in France at the time, again, an indication. And he said, in order for artists and creative people more generally, we ought to live together in a neighborhood where we wouldn't have any of these bourgeois telling us how to dress or think or go to church or whatever. Then we can be free. And if you're free, then you can be more creative. And that idea was the idea of bohemian lifestyle, neighborhood placemaking, enhancing because of proximity, which we have as well in a Boys Town, in Wicker Park, in other neighborhoods cited and elaborated in various ways today around us. Rich Lloyd's book, of course, on Wicker Park called Neo-Bohemia is exactly a continuation of these same themes. Then we get to Schumpeter, the economist in the 1940s. We get to Jane Jacobs, who we've talked about briefly, although we may have a little bit more with hers. We get to Richard Florida. We get then to a couple of serious social scientists, Ed Glaser, and he's wavered in terms of this, but he at least has written about our amenities and non-market transactions are more important than money and markets in defining what cities do and whether they're successful or not. That you wouldn't expect that from a simple so-called economic determinist, illustrating the point that the economists are not in any way necessarily economic determinists the way a lot of sociologists are and many political scientists, frankly. Okay. I've given some big overview themes right here. We could elaborate, but let me instead just say a few words on several other of the readings in this section, and then we can push ahead and discuss them ideally. The next reading is Aaron Wildavsky calls a cultural theory of leadership. Wildavsky was number one, number two political scientist, student of Dahl, 60s, 70s, 80s. His reputation was initially based on studying budgets and on the US national budget, and then the city of Oakland, which he studied when he was at Berkeley. Many books on Oakland politics and economics. And the theory up until the time of Proposition 13 in California was that big decisions, or there are no big decisions, that political decision-making and budgets are mostly incremental additions to what happened the year before. That history is history, and that the hands of history are so strong that we can't really change the big size of the budget if we're in China or if we're in Chicago. Then along came Proposition 13, and Jerry Brown, who was and is governor of California then and now, and in between he was mayor of Oakland. His father had been the governor of California, Pat Brown, and built most of the campuses of the University of California that make it so famous, and the freeways, and a lot of the infrastructure that makes California its contemporary structure. But the son, and then when people proposed there was a referendum coming up, and Jerry Brown, all the civic leaders, the unions, the Chamber of Commerce, all the smart people, the press, the newspapers all said, no, don't vote for this crazy, wild idea. And what did the citizens of California do? 66% roughly voted in favor of Proposition 13, which said we will cut property taxes by half immediately. in the whole state of California. And it happened. So this was a citizen taxpayers revolt. This was the essence, the quintessential event of this. You know, somebody could be, can you make yourself mute if, or yeah, maybe if necessary, Andy can make everybody mute except a speaker or two. With Prop 13 passing, Vildovsky, within not very long, said, hey, my theory's wrong. This is a revolution. The budget of Oakland didn't change incrementally. Everything changed in the state of California, all of a sudden. So what did he do? He looked around, what kinds of theories can we look for, can we come up with? And he found one of the top English anthropologists was named Mary Douglas. And she, like Levi-Strauss, was not just working on people in the jungle. She was working on contemporary societies and trying to join things together. And they have a 4-box kind of theory of classifying ideal types: slavery, markets, hierarchy. But his point, in addition to, say, Parsons's ideas, is that these 4 things are there all the time. It's closer to our scenes idea. Scenes don't, unlike Marx, history doesn't end when capitalism ends. You have capitalism still continuing, as in China today, with feudalism, with slavery, with other things, fighting each other. And it's the dynamic relations among them that are important to understand some of what's going on at any point in time. So it's a dialectic, but not quite a Hegelian, Marxian, more linear type of dialectic. Okay, that idea Vildovsky used for the second half of his life in lots of books. And this is a brief summary of them, but he has all kinds of things, but I'll simply leave it there for the moment and say, glance at it and more, and you'll be illuminated. The Schumacher paper I want to mention briefly because it doesn't look so grand. It's about Lawrence, Kansas, college town. Bob Lineberry I knew Paul Schumacher. Bob Lineberry was a political scientist there, but Schumacher was a student and then professor there for most of his career. And fascinated they were with how these bigger themes could also be found in Lawrence. So one bigger theme, which you could link to capitalism, the idea that the drivers of capitalism are the developers, the capitalists who bring in investment and want to build more buildings. This is the strong argument of Clarence Stone. This is the argument of the growth machine of Molich and what's his co-author? John Logan and Molich, et cetera, that's in the next section of the course. That is, these ideas, then Schumacher said, why don't we talk to the citizens? Because these theories from Harvey Molich and from many others ignored the citizens. They said the elites, the developers, are just doing this. So what Schumacher did that was innovative was go around and ask citizens about what are all the issues going on. So issue areas were not just 2 or 3, they had dozens and dozens of them, and said, how important are these? What do they do? Then they grouped them, and then they'd rank them, and then they asked the citizens, what do you favor or oppose? And several were related to economic development, building more houses, growing the place. And then question was, what proportion of the citizens in this college town wanted more growth? And the simple answer is a huge majority. So were the developers implicitly or explicitly fighting against the citizens? Not at all. Okay, that's the bottom line. Barbara Furman, Challenging the Growth Machine. Her title touches on the same main point, that that the theories of the growth machine and the drivers of the regime, the developers and others, were in conflict with the political system or aspects of some aspects of it. So she comes to this. She taught at IIT with Bill Grimshaw, and she has really a terrific comparison of Chicago and Pittsburgh. Case study. She starts with cases in Pittsburgh, such as, could we build a park? A group might bring a petition. They might bring it to a city council member. City council member might try to get it done, would talk to some people in the administration, might talk to the mayor, might talk to others, might have other organized groups that would come in. They'd talk about parks, they'd talk about the budget, talk about construction. And then the decision would be made, yes or no, let's build a park. In Chicago, if someone would say, here's a neighborhood group, let's build a new park, she suggests the classic way that happens is you go to the alderman or you go to the ward committeeman or a precinct captain who take it up, and then it gets discussed and labeled in some way. And the classic labels, and this is now, quote, diversity entering and different conceptions of diversity. In Chicago, whether it's a park or a casino or a bicycle path, it gets labeled in terms of power and race and ethnic politics. And if you're in favor of the park, the question is, are you black or white? Do you have a strong ethnic group behind you or not? And are you with an alderman or a committeeman who is well connected traditionally to the political machine, the Cook County Democratic Party? If the answer was yes, then it'd go ahead. If the answer was no, it would not. So the point is, there's only one issue to overstate. There's only one issue area, and there are a couple of overlapping issue areas in Chicago, which are ethnicity, race, and the machine. Doesn't matter if it's a park. It doesn't matter if it's a freeway. It doesn't matter if it's a casino. That's a very different definition of how cities make decisions. So I'm exaggerating slightly, as did she, and she pointed out that after the election of Harold Washington, things changed a lot. And she has another paper further down on the list with Bill Grimshaw, where they talked about Harold Washington's policies and the like. But that's the argument, and you can see that is being used in some discussions, some discourses, some debates today. And so think of how issue areas get defined is part of the, Habermas did this in saying the issue area of what you do in a coffee house gets redefined between Paris and London. You can't talk about some things, etc. So let's see here. Furman. Let's take another revolutionary idea. What's one of the quintessential definitions of American values and lifestyle? Lipset has a book called the American Exceptionalism, of how it's different from the Europeans, and his in a sense, his key ideas are individualism and egalitarianism. Those two values are critically different and pushed in different ways in the US from even where they originated with the Scottish philosophers. So not to mention Paris or Rome. Individualism, thus joined with aspects of egalitarianism, led people to emigrate from European countries at the beginning, especially England, and then to start, if they didn't want to stay right in Boston or New Haven, they'd go west. Who were the quintessential, who was there like Baudelaire that illustrates this. And let's think as well as another Lipset book called Continental Divide. North of the border with Canada and south of the border. What was the difference in the westward move and the definition of the core values of Canada versus the US in this respect? The wagon trains, the cowboys fighting the Indians, and then after they got to California and came back, all those movies from Hollywood about cowboys and Indians and John Wayne and the World War II troops fighting the Japanese. Cowboys are as an archetypical Ronald Reagan-like illustration of American individualism. Think motorcycles. Maybe you folks are not near enough, but in where I am, right between King Drive and Lakeshore Drive, I hear a whole lot of motorcycles these days, and I did all through, especially when we were having looting going on. Motorcycles in Illinois, do you see guys, you notice any of how they're different from, say, places in other states? Do they wear helmets? State of Illinois said, yeah, everybody ought to have a helmet. Obviously, you're going fast. It's dangerous. So the state legislature was discussing, and as typically happened in those days, you have maybe 400 or 500 guys on motorcycles, and they go down to Springfield and they ride around the state capitol on their motorcycles and then leave. They don't have to say anything to anybody, but what's known was, we don't want to be told that we have to wear helmets. And so a lot of those guys don't wear helmets. Do they go along at 30 miles an hour or 45 on Lakeshore Drive? No. A few do, but a lot of them can go 2 or 3 times as fast, day at night. They used to race regularly along Lakeshore Drive as well as some cars, but the point is, the police often would not stop them, nor would the state authorities. Individualism is still there in Illinois, and we've now got the highest COVID ranking in the country. So individualism is not just in California or with the Wild West, it's with the cars. And so if we have things like freeways built by Pat Brown and Lakeshore Drive and these kinds of things, how does that work with cities? Cities are really, and so there are 3 mics that wrote about Los Angeles. We've got one of you is working on LA, and so the politics of LA. Mike Davis, Mike Deere, and there's a third Mike whose name I'm blocking on, but he's the one who's written about General Motors, General Motors really dominating America. And the idea is, and through what? Of course, the car. So the car dominates as a vehicle for individual articulation of freedom of doing what you want. And so mayors can't control their speed, motorcycles. And so what can they do? They have to follow this style. All right, let's flash forward and show one entrepreneurial mayor who said no. His name is John Norquist. So you go ahead and show it as soon as you're ready, but I'm just talking until you're ready. He came and talked to my classes here a couple of times. He was mayor of Milwaukee.
Plan we put in place, and
here we go. Here he is.
There's more than twice as many people living in downtown now, about 15,000 people living in very urban, and it's still growing even though we're in the middle of a recession. There's still going on. We went from 2 developers who had their hand out asking for subsidies to 33 developers, almost all of which didn't get subsidies because we platted and zoned the city to make it easier to develop. And this is, I just want to go through these road pictures and we'll get back on the other subject. But this is the most dramatic redo of a city is Seoul, South Korea. And right after the Korean War, this double-deck freeway was built over the river. They went right through the middle of Seoul. And in 2001, they decided to take it down. By 2003, they were done. They did it, and they put in streets. with just 2 moving lanes in each direction to replace a freeway that carried 150,000 cars a day. And that's what it looks like, billions of dollars of real estate value. The guy who did it, there he is. Lee Bok, who's now the president of South Korea, but he was really happy when he was mayor, you can see in the picture. He had the guts to do the right thing. And, you know, it was, oh, but if we do that, it might not work. Well, he went ahead and did it, and it did work. And, you know, sometimes you have to do things that seem a little counterintuitive. In Seattle, they have the Alaskan Viaduct right on the waterfront. And we met with the governor's people, and her people said, you know, Seattle's a big city. You can't take that out of there. There's no way that you can do the traffic with it gone. And we said, well, that's interesting, because if you go 200 miles north, there's Vancouver. It's about the same size, and they don't have a freeway. You know, and they in the whole city, they don't have one freeway in the whole city. And they have the most buoyant real estate market in Canada. But let's give them one. You know, so we photoshopped one in there. Or give it to Paris. You know, that's a big city and they don't have freeways. Maybe they should have one too. You know, I mean, it's really absurd to think. Here's Brisbane, Australia, and they're planning on taking this out now because it actually creates traffic jams wherever the ramps are, wherever the nodes are. And in traffic, if to understand traffic, it's useful, I think, to look at wetlands, which we tried to conquer for 200 years of our country's existence, to conquer reclaim them, the Bureau of Reclamation. And now we know that wetlands actually have a value, a lot of value. You can start, the list goes on, but just for starters, it slows down the flooding. It absorbs water. It's a setting for plants and animals. It's a great place actually to do real estate development if you get on the edges of it away from the actual wetland. It really works well. After people figure out that the bats and the birds and everything eat all the mosquitoes anyway, so you don't have to worry about that. So we don't do this much anymore. We don't pave the streams. It still could happen, but when it happens, everybody knows it's the wrong thing to do. So the water engineers have figured it out. The Army Corps of Engineers have figured it out. It's a bad idea to drain wetlands. But if you look at traffic, the money we're spending is all for stuff that's just like that channelized stream running through the wetlands or through the Everglades. It undoes the complexity of the city. This is what the Wisconsin DOT said, well-planned highway systems enhance safety and traffic flow. That's actually not true. Anyway, but you know, so this is what they do, this is what they spend money on, and that's what they think their mission is. And then this is this afterthought over here, the local roads. But where's all the value? It's here. And actually, in terms of traffic distribution, there's far more traffic on these roads, which are locally paid for, than these big ones. And so the whole system is sort of biased against the urban configuration. So what we're doing.
What's the time here? 30, is that about it? Okay. Context. What did he do as mayor? He tore down the exits to the freeways. So you couldn't get on or off the freeway when it was going by when he was mayor. The only big city at that time in America that did so, and then he moved and became the executive director of the Council or Conference for the New Urbanism here in Chicago, and then traveled internationally and did things like the video you have here. And he wrote a book which said basically, don't do what all the other people say, the left or the right, you know, do things which make sense for your city. And when he came to one class we had here, I couldn't believe it. He had about 200 slides, and more than half, maybe a third of them were of Renaissance cities. The mayor of Milwaukee, Renaissance Italy. So he would show streets that would have an aesthetic sensitivity. And what he was trying to explore was, how can you help build a city so that people will walk more and the pedestrians will feel comfortable. And so you could have nice views. And so the idea that you saw there in Paris of Haussmann came from the Italians, perhaps in part, of having a cross, but these grand boulevards, avenues really helped define Paris in one way. Washington, D.C. was designed by a Frenchman as well, and it has a circle, but again, with big boulevards. So the new urbanism, you just ought to know the name, is a movement that started by a couple of architecture students at Yale. And it's become this conference. They've got lots of books, and they're very popular among younger now middle-aged architects and planners, and city people thinking about cities, sort of urbanists more generally. But the general idea, which you have articulated, say in Richard Florida, for instance, is kill the car. Does that mean you kill individualism? Say, how can you not be attacked for killing individualism if you instead can enhance the pedestrian? Okay, these are themes which are with us today, and which I won't try to give you an answer to, but I'm pointing to the readings from Wildavsky, from Benjamin, from Habermas, of trying to assess the ways in which these get discussed as politically correct, or so politically incorrect we don't dare talk about them on the talk shows even. Okay, why don't we see if we can have a little discussion on some of this. Lots of ideas all over the place, but big ideas that inform what we do today. Look at our Daniel Lee, you're from Seoul, I believe. Still there?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, I am.
Any comments on Seoul and the success of that destruction of the freeways? Pedestrians?
Right. I think the flaneur concept in relation to the success of the freeway is also interesting, because while it did allow for this, well, the freeway that was opened, that's also called Cheonggyecheon. Well, it's not a freeway, but it's also a path through which people can observe the city. What Lee Myung-bak did essentially was allow for easier, better, more efficient transportation, but also the observation of the city as flaneurs for people. So I think this like double improvement through infrastructure is something that is interesting to consider.
Hee-Sung Jong was a student at IIT in architecture and worked with us here for a couple of years. And she worked as well in Paris and Seoul. And she was shocked by the huge differences between the subways in the three cities. That in Chicago, the subways are scary, dangerous, feared, people stay away from them, and so forth. In Paris, they're pretty nice, but in Seoul, they are charismatic. They've got people nearby, within, or just outside some of the major subway intersections, where they have concerts that are promoted and publicized and funded in part by the city of Seoul. So she in turn tried to analyze where and why do we get subways? Where do we get divvy bicycle sharing? Where do we enhance the use of public transit and which doesn't have to kill the motorcycle or the individual, but can transform it. And so she has really worked creatively on this and used explicitly some of the things which you see here: Baudelaire, Bohemia, tracing that through Jane Jacobs up to these themes of cities today. But and then in case studies, I won't try to go into for reasons of time, in her PhD and then their publications, which are now out from her, Heysun Jeong. She showed, for example, not only in the cases of those 3 cities, but also in the entire set of zip codes in the United States, in the 30,000 French communes, and in cities across Korea. If you do statistical analysis and you control income, education, occupation, a bunch of things like that, and say what enhances the use of public transit, what raises the use of bicycles for commuting to work, and what do you find? Various measures of Bohemia. Think about that. So she plays this out, and she's now doing field work, and she's working teaching as an assistant professor in nearby Dallas. So Texas is a great place to pursue this, as these issues are not so, the cowboy's still alive, and much more alive in literally in Texas than in Chicago. But the motorcycle versus the divvy bikes, I'm featuring in some of the discussion here, and the respective subcultures. I'll just add that I've done biking a fair amount myself, that is manual biking, with me the engine, and notice big cultural differences in different types of cycling groups, triathletes versus road bike racers, and so forth. They have very different styles, shouting, swearing, jumping, quietly using engineering solutions or scientific or raucous or whatever else, so that these things matter. Okay, I'm suggesting that is, or I'm playing metaphorical, artistic case in my cycling example, but I'm citing Heysun Jeong for her statistical quantitative analysis of many cases that come up with the same results. The same results as Benjamin, Baudelaire, Jane Jacobs, and Norquist. Anyone else have a question or comment on any of these themes? We're close to the neighborhood, but let's save that for a later session. We're going to hear about that. Let's pose it as a question. Where and why do we have gay neighborhoods, and why are they important? And are they rising or declining, and why? And how do they relate to these factors we've talked about today and her test? Okay. To be continued. All right, it's 5:20, folks. Thank you for a little trip on motorcycle, bicycle, and most of all, pretend being a flaneur as you walk through a few hours or whatever you want in life. That is, that the idea of the flaneur was not just looking for food, but was writing, reflecting, if not poetry, then essays and theories like Benjamin's and more. Okay. See you on Monday. Yeah, we can meet briefly for office hours if anybody has something they want to bring up.